On the 5th of May, 1818, in the small German city of Trier, an ancient Roman settlement tucked into the valley of the Moselle River, surrounded by vineyards and the quiet respectability of provincial bourgeois life, a boy is born into a family of Jewish lawyers and rabbis who have converted to Protestantism to navigate the social restrictions of the era. His father, Heinrich, is a man of the Enlightenment, rational, cultured, and deeply influenced by the French philosophers who argued that reason and progress would eventually liberate humanity from superstition and tyranny. His mother, Henriette, is practical, domestic, and largely indifferent to the intellectual world her husband inhabits, and her son will soon consume entirely. This boy, born into comfort, raised on Enlightenment idealism, and educated among the sharpest minds in Germany, will spend the rest of his life in poverty, exile, and furious intellectual labor, producing a body of work that will inspire revolutions on every continent, reshape the political landscape of the entire 20th century, and remain the most argued about, most praised, and most condemned set of ideas in the modern world. The boy who will become Karl Marx grows up in a household that sits at an uncomfortable intersection of worlds. Trier, in the early 19th century, is a city still digesting the aftershocks of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era that followed it. The old feudal order of German society, with its rigid hierarchies of aristocracy, guild, and church, has been shaken but not destroyed. The Rhineland, where Trier sits, was under French control for nearly 2 decades, and the Napoleonic legal codes introduced during that period, particularly the abolition of many restrictions on Jewish participation in public life, created a brief window of possibility for families like the Marxes. When Prussia reasserts control of the region after Napoleon's defeat, that window begins to close again. Heinrich Marx, Karl's father, navigates this shift by converting the family from Judaism to Lutheranism, a pragmatic decision that allows him to continue practicing law under the new Prussian restrictions. It is not a decision made from religious conviction. Heinrich is, by every account, a man of the French Enlightenment, a reader of Voltaire and Rousseau, a believer in reason, progress, and the capacity of educated men to improve the world through thought and argument. He is also a man who understands that survival sometimes requires compromise with the world as it is, rather than the world as it should be. Karl absorbs his father's intellectual passions completely, and his father's willingness to compromise, not at all. From his earliest years, Karl is described by those around him as unusually intense, unusually argumentative, and unusually certain of his own conclusions. He dominates conversations. He reads voraciously and remembers everything. He has a gift for identifying the weakest point in any argument and driving into it with a persistence that his teachers find simultaneously impressive and exhausting. He is also, from early on, preoccupied by a question that the comfortable bourgeois world of Trier does its best to avoid asking. Why, in a society that calls itself civilized and progressive, do so many people have so little, while so few people have so much? It is a question he will spend the rest of his life trying to answer. And the answer he arrives at will change the world. Karl Marx arrives at the University of Bonn in 1835 at the age of 17, ostensibly to study law in the respectable tradition of his father. He lasts 1 year. He drinks, he duels, he accumulates debts. He joins a poets' club and writes romantic verse of no particular distinction. Heinrich Marx, exasperated, transfers him to the University of Berlin, a considerably more serious institution, in the hope that the change of environment will produce a change of habits. It does not produce a change of habits. It produces something far more consequential. Berlin, in the late 1830s, is the intellectual center of Germany, and its university is dominated by the towering legacy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the philosopher who died in 1831, but whose ideas have fractured the German intellectual world into warring camps. Hegel's central contribution is a way of understanding history as a process of conflict and resolution. The idea that every era contains within it contradictions that eventually produce a crisis, and that crisis produces a new order, which in turn contains its own contradictions, and so the process continues. History, for Hegel, is not a random sequence of events. It is a logical unfolding, driven by the collision of opposing forces. Marx encounters this framework, and it seizes him completely. He joins a group of radical young thinkers known as the Young Hegelians, who are taking Hegel's ideas in directions their conservative originator would not have approved of, applying the logic of historical contradiction not to the spiritual realm, but to the material world of politics, economics, and social power. Marx goes further than any of them. He takes Hegel's framework and turns it upside down. For Hegel, ideas drive history. For Marx, material conditions, who owns what, who controls the means of producing food and goods and shelter, drive history. Ideas are the product of those material conditions, not their cause. The class that controls production controls thought itself. It is a conclusion of staggering ambition and staggering implications. And Marx is barely 25 years old when he arrives at it. He does not complete his law degree. He earns a doctorate in philosophy instead, submitting a thesis on ancient Greek materialism that foreshadows everything he will spend the next 4 decades developing. He wants an academic career. The Prussian authorities, already alarmed by his radical associations, make that impossible. He turns to journalism instead. Marx throws himself into journalism with the same intensity he brings to everything. In 1842, he became editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal newspaper based in Cologne, and immediately transformed it into one of the most provocative publications in Germany. He writes about press censorship, peasant poverty, and the growing gap between the prosperous classes and the workers whose labor sustains them. The Prussian authorities, predictably, shut the paper down within months. Marx is 24 years old and already unemployable in his own country. He moves to Paris with his new wife, Jenny von Westphalen, the daughter of a Prussian baron and a woman of exceptional intelligence and loyalty who will spend the next 4 decades at his side through poverty, exile, and grief that would have broken most people entirely. Paris in the 1840s is the radical capital of Europe, alive with socialist thinkers, revolutionary émigrés, and workers beginning to develop a political consciousness about their own exploitation. Marx devours all of it. He reads the French socialists. He studies economics for the first time, encountering Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and begins to understand that the key to everything he wants to explain lies not in philosophy alone, but in the mechanics of how capitalist economies actually function. And in Paris, in 1844, he meets Friedrich Engels. The partnership that forms between these two men is one of the most consequential intellectual collaborations in modern history. Engels is the son of a wealthy German textile manufacturer with factories in Manchester, England. He has spent time working in those factories and has seen firsthand the conditions of the English working class, a world of 16-hour days, child labour, tuberculosis, and wages so low that survival itself becomes a daily calculation. He has written about it in a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, a document of such raw, precise anger that Marx reads it and recognizes immediately that he has found the person who understands exactly what he is trying to say. Engels is also critically willing to fund Marx. For the rest of Marx's life, Engels provides financial support that, while never sufficient to lift Marx out of poverty, keeps him alive and working. The relationship is not simply one of patron and dependent. It is a genuine meeting of minds, a collaboration in which Engels's practical knowledge of industrial capitalism constantly grounds and sharpens Marx's theoretical framework. Together they are more than the sum of their parts. In 1847, Marx and Engels were commissioned by a small organization of European socialist workers called the Communist League to write a political program. The document they produced in the winter of 1847 to 1848 is one of the most consequential pieces of political writing in human history. The Communist Manifesto is not a long document. It runs to approximately 12,000 words. It can be read in a single sitting, but its opening line, perhaps the most famous sentence in the history of political writing, announces its ambition without hesitation. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And its central argument, stripped of its historical context and its 19th century vocabulary, is both simple and radical. All of human history, Marx and Engels argue, is the history of class struggle. The conflict between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labor to survive has driven every major historical transformation from ancient slave societies through feudalism and into the capitalism of their own era. And capitalism, for all its extraordinary productive power, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. It creates a working class, the proletariat, that it simultaneously exploits and organizes. And an organized working class will eventually recognize its own power and use it. The manifesto ends with a call that will echo across the next century and a half. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. It is published in February 1848. Within weeks, revolution breaks out across Europe. The timing appears almost supernatural. Paris erupts first, then Vienna, then Berlin, Budapest, Milan, Rome. In the space of a few months, the established order of Europe is shaking on its foundations, monarchies are toppling, and the frightened aristocracies of half a continent are making hasty concessions to avoid complete collapse. Marx rushes back to Germany, convinced that the revolution he has theorized is actually happening. He founded a new newspaper in Cologne, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and threw himself into the political struggle with a ferocious energy. But the revolutions of 1848 do not hold. One by one, the conservative forces reassert control. The uprisings are crushed. The concessions are withdrawn. The old order, shaken but not broken, reassembles itself with a brutality that ends any remaining ambiguity about whether it will reform itself peacefully. Marx is expelled from Germany. He was refused entry to France. He has nowhere left to go. In 1849, he arrived in London. He will never leave. London in 1849 is the largest and richest city in the world. It is also for Karl Marx a city of grinding, humiliating, relentless poverty. He arrives with Jenny and their children and settles in Soho, in a cramped two-room flat in Dean Street that is, by any measure, inadequate for a family of their size. The conditions are appalling. There is no reliable income. Engels sends money when he can, but it is never enough. Several of Marx's children die in infancy, deaths directly attributable to the poverty and overcrowding of the family's living conditions. His son Edgar, whom Marx calls Mush and loves with a particular tenderness, dies of tuberculosis at the age of 8. Marx later writes to Engels that the death has broken something in him that he does not know how to repair. He works anyway. Every day, often for 12 hours or more, he walks to the reading room of the British Museum and sits at his assigned desk, surrounding himself with mountains of books, government reports, factory inspection records, and economic data, building the theoretical structure that will become his masterwork. Das Kapital, the first volume of which is published in 1867, after nearly 2 decades of research and writing, is a work of staggering intellectual ambition. It is not, contrary to popular understanding, primarily a political pamphlet or a call to revolution. It is an attempt to do for capitalism what Newton did for physics, to identify the fundamental laws governing how the system actually operates, where its value comes from, how it distributes that value, and why its internal logic produces, with the inevitability of a mathematical proof, the exploitation of workers and the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. Its central concept is the theory of surplus value. Workers, Marx argues, produce more value through their labor than they receive in wages. The difference, the surplus, is appropriated by the capitalist who owns the means of production. This is not theft in the legal sense, it is simply how the system works. It is the mechanism by which capital reproduces and expands itself. And it is, Marx argues, the source of every inequality, every crisis, and every conflict that capitalism generates. Das Kapital sells modestly on publication. It is reviewed seriously in Germany and largely ignored in England, the country whose industrial capitalism it dissects with such forensic precision. Marx had hoped it would detonate a political explosion. It does not yet. While Das Kapital makes its modest entrance into the world, Marx is simultaneously engaged in the most ambitious organizational project of his life. In 1864, A coalition of British and French trade unionists, Polish nationalists, Italian republicans, and various strands of European socialist thought came together in London to form the International Working Men's Association, which history will call the First International. It is the first serious attempt to build a genuinely international organization of the working class, a structure that might coordinate labor movements across national borders and give the scattered forces of radical politics a common platform and a common voice. Marx is not its founder. He is invited to participate as one voice among many. Within months, he is its dominant intellectual force, drafting its founding documents, writing its addresses, and steering its political direction with a combination of theoretical authority and organizational tenacity that leaves most of his colleagues unable to keep up. He is also, characteristically, fighting internal battles simultaneously, battling against the anarchist wing of the organization, led by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, who believes that the state must be abolished immediately and completely, rather than seized and used as a transitional instrument of working-class power. The dispute between Marx and Bakunin is not merely personal, though it is also intensely personal. It is a fundamental disagreement about the nature of revolution that will divide the left for the next century and a half. Then, in the spring of 1871, something happened that Marx had spent his entire adult life theorizing about and never expected to see in his own lifetime: the Paris Commune. In the aftermath of France's catastrophic defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the workers of Paris seized control of the city and established a radical, self-governing commune that implemented, in real time and at real scale, many of the ideas Marx had been developing in theory for 3 decades. Elected officials are subject to immediate recall. Worker representatives replace professional bureaucrats. The separation between legislative and executive power is abolished. The commune arms the working class and disarms the professional military. It lasts 72 days. The French government, reconstituted at Versailles, sends the army back into Paris. The suppression is savage. Somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 communards are killed in what becomes known as the Bloody Week. Marx watches from London, writing a searing analysis of the Commune's rise and fall that he publishes as the Civil War in France. He celebrates what the Commune achieved and mourns what its destruction reveals: that the forces defending the existing order will use any level of violence necessary to preserve it. The Paris Commune breaks something in the First International that cannot be repaired. The association of Marx's name with the Commune, however indirect his actual involvement, makes him simultaneously the most celebrated and the most feared radical thinker in Europe. Governments across the continent treat him as a dangerous conspirator. Conservative newspapers blame him personally for the violence of the Commune. He receives death threats. He is watched by police agents from multiple countries. The man who has spent his entire adult life in obscure poverty, working in the reading room of the British Museum while the world went about its business, suddenly finds himself famous in the worst possible way. He is also, by this point, genuinely ill. The decades of poverty, overwork, inadequate food, and the accumulated grief of lost children and a life lived in permanent financial crisis have destroyed his health. He suffers from a chronic liver condition, from pleurisy, from carbuncles so severe that he cannot sit at his desk to write for months at a time. Jenny Marx, his wife of nearly 4 decades, the woman who chose poverty and exile over the comfortable life her aristocratic background had prepared her for, develops cancer. She died in December 1881. Marx is at her bedside. He is too ill to attend her funeral. He outlives her by just over a year. In that final year, his eldest daughter, Jenny Caroline, also died of cancer. Marx, already weakened beyond recovery, does not survive the blow. On the 14th of March, 1883, Karl Marx died in his armchair in his London flat, quietly, alone, his housekeeper finding him gone when she checked on him. He is 64 years old. The funeral at Highgate Cemetery on the 17th of March is attended by 11 people. Engels delivers the graveside address, telling the small gathering that just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. It is a generous and carefully considered claim. It is also, in the decades that follow, precisely how Marx's followers will present him, not as a political thinker whose ideas are open to debate and revision, but as a scientist whose discoveries are objectively true and whose conclusions are therefore beyond question. That framing, more than any single idea Marx ever wrote, is what produces the 20th century that follows.